Hi everybody, I'm Rook, welcome back. Today we're looking at some early meta decks coming out of the Battle City box. I have particularly different decks that I want to just briefly go over with you guys and touch on. A few of these decks we're seeing consistently. These kind of erupted out of the early meta. As we expected, a couple of these decks people were really excited to play. I'm taking a look at the top 4 decks specifically of a recent online tournament, one that kind of came out immediately when the box was released. This was over at the Yugioh Legacy Discord server. That link is in the description below. They have reoccurring tournaments that you can certainly enter, and they are definitely diving into this box from a competitive and meta format. These were the decks that topped earlier this month, and I had the pleasure of commentating the semifinals and grand finals of this tournament alongside Terramaster, who is one of the founders of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Legacy. So that YouTube channel and link is in the description below, along with their Discord, where they will host more tournaments. I hope you guys check that out, especially if you're looking to get in the early meta. We're looking at the top 2 decks today in this video. We're looking at the decks that took first and second in this particular tournament. The meta's still being figured out, but I figured, hey, you know, it's after the holidays and New Year's almost here. I think that some people might have just a little extra cash, or maybe got a Speed Duel box in their Christmas stocking and wanted to just check out what's meta right now and what's forming. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of insight of what the meta is shifting and shaping out to be. This is still very early, but there are a couple decks here particularly that my gut is that it's going to be very consistent alongside fun. It's going to be a really fun deck to play. There are a couple. You're looking at the first one right now. This is number 1 that won this tournament. This is Ryan Atlas's XYZ Dragon Cannon deck. So we knew that this was going to be insane. We saw MBT get this deck in a Vault's YugiTuber tournament and just run with it and run all the way to the top with it. It's got so much synergy, it's nuts. Like, the level of synergy that we're seeing in Speed Duel now is so much higher in a couple different decks than what we saw before, you know, especially in a meta perspective, because before the meta was like, here are a bunch of cards that all work on their own, put them in a deck together. But now we have serious synergy. XYZ Dragon Cannon is a great one to start with. This is Speed Duel, so it's a 20 card deck. So to cram all of these cards that work so well together in a 20 card deck, it's very consistent. Seeing it firsthand in the matches that I commentated with Terramaster, super consistent with XYZ. You can see here, we'll start just going through the monsters, going through the cards in general. You'll notice that the monsters are only the XYZ parts. We have 2 X-Head Cannon, 2 Y-Dragon Head, 3 Z-Metal Tank. Z-Metal Tank's the better one because it can equip to both Y-Dragon Head and X-Head Cannon, whereas Y-Dragon Head could only equip to X-Head Cannon. Y-Dragon Head, if equipped to X-Head Cannon, gives a 400 attack. But Z-Metal Tank, if equipped to Y or X, gives 600 attack, and if it would be destroyed, you actually destroy Z-Metal Tank, so that's pretty good. On their own, the attacks are okay. They're 15. Actually, X-Head's at 18. So with Y or Z, we're looking at like a 2400 attack monster, so it's pretty strong with the equips. And you are most likely going to see these cards right on the field right away because there's so much synergy here. So X, Y, and Z, those are the only monsters. I feel that this deck is one of the decks where it doesn't really allow any room for any other monsters because it's just so compact and you always want to get these. So in terms of a teching, and I can get into the side deck here too, but in terms of teching different cards, I think that you might want to stay away from that right now. This is definitely, you definitely want these pieces, and it seems to be working. It seems to be enough. Keep in mind that the skill Ryan used here is the Union Combination, which is the skill for XYZ Dragon Cannon, which essentially states that once per turn, you can fusion summon a light machine monster from your extra deck using pieces from your field or graveyard. So the important thing about that is the graveyard. That's one of the reasons why this deck's so good, because you can essentially get one piece of the Dragon Cannon out at any given time, as long as you've got monsters in the field or graveyard. Let's go on to the spells here. We do have Union Hanger, which is the field spell. We're seeing field spells again, which is great. When the card is activated, you can add a light machine Union monster from deck to hand. So when it comes out on the field, you get a monster deck to hand. That's just when it comes out. And then once per turn, if a light machine Union monster is normal special summoned, you can target one of those monsters, equip the appropriate light machine Union to it. So this is how you're going to get your equips all the time, with Z-Metal Tank equipping to Y or X, Y equipping to X. They're all just equipping to each other thanks to Union Hanger. If you get this out pretty early, you're set, especially because you're getting the extra Union card into your hand, so there's some hand advantage there too. So Union Hanger, pretty solid spell to have at 3, of course. We have Foolish Burial here, which we knew was going to be a problem because this one sends a monster from your deck to the graveyard. Keep in mind the Union Combination allows you to use cards from your graveyard. That's why we have Foolish Burial here. Ryan is able to send some of these pieces to the grave and get some of these nasty fusions out early, even as early as turn 1 or 2. The last spell he's running is Book of Moon, which I think that we're going to see pretty consistently right now just because it's such a... I can't believe they put this in the box card. Book of Moon is currently something that you definitely have to work around if you're playing against, so I think everyone's kind of splashing it into their deck right now. Really solid defensive. It's essentially the new Windstorm of Otaku and Nightmare Rules Zoma. You know, Book of Moon is really getting you out of any situation, and it works around a card like Jinzo because it's not a trap. So Book of Moon just flips something face down. Sometimes you don't want things to go in the graveyard. As you can see, you know, being in the graveyard seems to be just fine for a deck like this XYZ Dragon Cannon deck because you can use it to fuse things. So we're moving just a little bit away from destroying monsters and more into kind of keeping them on the field but rendering their effects worthless with a card like Book of Moon that flips it to face down. So that's the last spell there. And one other thing to add about the Union combination skill, please remember, guys, when you use it to fusion summon, your opponent can't take battle damage that turn, so you can still beat over stuff, but your opponent can't take battle damage. So it's not as broken, but the field control is absolutely insane, which is especially get Union hanging out early. We got a couple traps here in the deck. We got Union Scramble. Union Scramble works because a lot of the fusion monsters require you to banish those pieces in order to fuse it. And so Union Scramble will allow you to target up to 3 your banished Light Machine normal monsters, which is all of the pieces, all of the monsters that are in this deck, and special summon them. And it's up to 3, so you don't have to have exactly 3 banished. You can have 1 banished, and this works, and you get to special summon it. So there's just more resources. All of a sudden, you're equipping it to other things, and now there's your once per turn. You can fuse for another XY or XYZ fusion, and the momentum keeps going. So Union Scramble is a perfect complement to this deck, and it's no wonder he's running at 3. One of the other things that I was talking to Terramaster about was that you notice how we went from like, there is really no banished in Speed Duel to all of a sudden, like, here's your banished, but you can just play with it as much as you want. This deck specifically is about getting things from deck to hand. Hand to graveyard, graveyard to banish, banish to the field, field back to hand. There's just so much playing around with the graveyard and banish now with this deck. It's definitely one of the reasons why I think this deck makes you think a little more than the previous meta that we saw prior to the box. Just playing around with banish, what do you want to get into the grave, what do you want to get back in your hand, onto the field. So I think that we're moving in the right direction there. The last trap in this #1 deck for this tournament for the XYZ Dragon Cannon is it's the rare Metal Morph, and this one you got to look out for because people look at this continuous face-up trap and they think it's just another kunai. You know, your machine monster gets 500 attack, but also negate the first spell effect that targets the monster, and when the monster leaves the field, destroy this card. So it's pulling a little Z-Metal tank too. It acts as a protective barrier if you're trying to destroy that monster the first time, and it negates the first spell effect that targets that monster. That's, I'm looking at you, Book of Moon. So rare Metal Morph is coming out of the clearing here, and it looks like it's going to be a staple in the XYZ deck. So we saw it work very well in the matches that Ryan had. Going over Ryan's side, just kind of justify some of these cards. So Knight Assailant is a card that we're actually going to see in a later deck. It's actually limited in regular Yu-Gi-Oh! Because there is a sort of loop that can happen here. This is a flip, target 1 monster your opponent controls, destroy that target. When it's sent from the hand to graveyard, target flip monster, graveyard, return to the hand. So there's an opportunity to get a loop here if you are discarding Knight Assailant to get Knight Assailant back, because a lot of the fusion monsters, their conditions require you to discard a card in order for an effect to happen. So Knight Assailant can be your discard fodder, and you just get this loop of Knight Assailants going back to your hand, discard infinitely. So that's a good loop. It's hard to place that in this deck. It's really hard to place any side in this very compact, synergized deck here. Maybe remove a Foolish Burial, maybe remove a Union Scramble. Hard to say. A Union Hanger and hope you draw it early. But I understand where he's coming from. I like the little bit of I like the craftiness here. We have a Kaiku in the side deck too. I'm seeing this consistently in side decks because this is when it inflicts battle damage. You can banish 2 monsters from the graveyard, which shuts a lot of decks down that are trying to utilize the graveyard with things like Foolish Burial. Now, obviously, with XYZ, it doesn't work that well because Union Scramble gets banished back. But Kaiku is pretty good for some other decks that you're fighting against. And then Lost Wind is going to be a side trap that's going to be really good against something like XYZ because there's a lot of special summoning. When you look at XYZ, you look at Valkyrian. This one targets a face-up special summon monster on the field, whatever was special summoned. You can negate its effects and half its original attack. That also worked pretty well against something like Dark Moth if we go back to the old meta. Here's where it's really specific to something like XYZ. If a monster is special summoned from your opponent's extra deck while this card is in your graveyard, you can set the card, banish it when it leaves the field. So it's got a little bit of like a Haunted Shrine effect going on here. It can work well from the grave. So there's a lot of value out of a card like Lost Wind. Very specific towards special summoning and extra deck summoning. But if we're going to see XYZ Dragon Cannon frequently, then this is going to be a good card to side. So I hope that gets a little insight into the side deck. And then, of course, going over the fusions, this fusion deck was a little different than this, but I just got one of each of the cannons here, just kind of demonstrate what resources he was working with to use Union Combination and what tanks he can get out. We actually rarely saw XYZ Dragon Cannon. We saw a lot of the XY and I think the YZ he used a lot. These monsters essentially do a lot of the same things. The attacks vary 21, 22, 24, and of course XYZ, the big boys, at 28. But they all have slightly different effects that involve discarding, which is why a card like Night Assailant might work well in the side deck. XYZ Dragon Cannon is you can discard a card and you can destroy any card your opponent controls. XY Dragon Cannon is you discard a card for a face-up spell or trap to destroy your opponent controls. XZ Tank Cannon, discard a card for a face-down spell trap your opponent controls. And YZ Tank to discard a card, target a face-down monster your opponent controls. That's going to work really well with a card like Book of Moon, for example. So they all do things a little different. XYZ is the kicker that'll destroy pretty much anything, and then the others are maybe you don't want to do the full fusion, and you want a nice monster out there, but at the same time you want to have that utility that we saw a lot of, like the YZ and the, I believe the XY coming from Ryan. So it's not all about trying to get XYZ out every time. Maybe it doesn't make sense to. Glossed over one of these side deck cards. Nobleman of Extermination. Nobleman of Extermination is the last side deck here, so we know what Nobleman of Crossout is, but Nobleman of Extermination is used a little more rarely, and there's a reason why. So if you read the card, it's you target a face-down spell trap in the field, destroy the target. If you do, banish it. Similar to Nobleman of Crossout, which is target a set monster. If it was a trap, each player reveals their main deck, banishes all cards from it with that card's name. So the thing that gets me here is that each player reveals their main deck. That's, you know, that gives your opponent so much information. Obviously, you get information also. If you happen to be running the same traps as your opponent, that's not great for you. I mean, it's okay that you're getting rid of multiples from your opponent's deck, and maybe there will be that level of kind of a read of what your opponent's playing, but Nobleman of Extermination is an interesting side. We actually saw him side that once and use it. Luckily, it was, I think it was like the only trap. No, I think that it was a spell, so we didn't even get to see a deck reveal on something like Dueling Book, which is insane. So Nobleman of Extermination, interesting side. I like to see that. That's the XYZ Dragon Cannon deck that topped this particular early meta box tournament over at Yu-Gi-Oh! Legacy. Moving on to deck 2. This deck was played by GN, who is another valued member in that community. And this is the other deck that I think we're going to see very consistently. And it's great to see because it's another one where there's a lot of pieces, a lot of intense synergy, and it really makes you think more than what the meta was before. So I love to see that these are the kind of decks that are doing well. This is a Valkyrie and the Magnet Warrior deck. All these pieces similar to XYZ, all Magnet Warrior related. We're not seeing any outside monsters here in the main deck anyway. Quick rundown of the cards. We know Valkyrian, you can get that by getting Alpha, Beta, and Gamma together, and of course you can split up Valkyrian to get Alpha, Beta, and Gamma back from the graveyard to the field. Special summon. So there's a little bit of utility there with Valkyrian, but the biggest part of this is to get Valkyrian out because it's a 3,500 attack monster, 3,850 defense monster. The defense is insane. Something like Book of Moon is really not, you can't beat over it with anything really. Not too much anyway. You'll notice as far as the pieces go, we have Beta, Gamma, Alpha here, but we have 3 Beta. It makes sense. That's the 1,700 attack monster, so it's going to put up the most fight. Then we have Gamma, which is a 1,500, and Alpha, 1,400. So these two are at 1. And I can understand the reasoning behind that here is because you really only need one of each in order to complete Valkyrian. And looking at the rest of the deck, yeah, it doesn't really have room for a second one of each. And, there are so many ways to search for it manually. So I think that this is a fine play. Keep in mind that the skill that Gian is using here is the Magnetic Attraction skill. The Magnetic Attraction skill does a couple things. One, if you get a Magnet Warrior out, you can search your deck for another one with a different name, reveal it, put it in your hand. And also, if you have 2 different types of Magnet Warriors out, you can search for Valkyrian, essentially. Each of those bullets can be used only once. And, what we saw in the tournament is that, they're being used pretty early, because very consistently you're going to have something like Beta in your hand, and you're going to be able to get the monsters required to get Valkyrian in your hand, and then you can play around with Valkyrian. You'll notice he's also running Delta the Magnet Warrior, which isn't necessarily a requirement for Valkyrian, but it has its own effect that makes it really good to get Valkyrian out. Delta the Magnet Warrior is a card that I definitely agree should be running at 3. When it's normal special summoned, you can send a level 4 or lower Magnet Warrior monster from deck to graveyard, so there's your Foolish Burial. It's a Foolish Burial monster, and if this card's sent to the graveyard, if you have 3 Magnet Warrior monsters in your graveyard, except for Delta, and they can all be betas. It doesn't have to be the 3, It doesn't have to be Alpha, Beta, Gamma. It could be 3 betas. If you have 3 level 4 or lower Magnet Warrior monsters from your graveyard, you special summon Valkyrian from your hand or deck, ignoring its summoning conditions. You get Valkyrian out if you have 3 in the graveyard and this goes away. So you can see why the attack and defensive delta doesn't really matter. He's really looking for it to get the monsters into the graveyard and then get it destroyed is another way of getting Valkyrian out. Obviously, you can traditionally get Valkyrian out by having all of the Magnet Warriors and combining them. It's not even a fusion, you just combine them. But Delta really, really greases the wheels in getting Valkyrian out pretty quickly. Looking at his spells, we see 3 Book of Moon, also scary. You know, Book of Moon is solid defense right now, something that we're going to see consistently. We have another magnet-specific spell. This is Magnetic Field. This is also a field spell, so that the top 2 decks both running field spells, which is cool to see. Magnetic Field is if you control level 4 or lower Earth Rock monster, so basically any of the pieces. You can target a level 4 or lower Magnet Warrior monster in your graveyard, special summon it. So this is why it's okay to have monsters in the graveyard. You can get them back out onto the field here. Also, once per turn, at the end of the damage step, you essentially bounce, you can bounce something to the hand if it didn't die. It gives you a little bit of like a Hyper Hammerhead effect here. That's once per turn. So when an Earth Rock monster you control battles an opponent monster, but the opponent's monster still stays alive, it was not destroyed by battle, you can return that monster to the hand. This is really good against something like XYZ because you think about how a lot of monsters might be fusions. So returning something to the extra deck is extra devastating and a little harder to get out than just putting it from your hand back onto the field. So Magnetic Field only works once per turn, but you get the special summon from the graveyard and you get a bounce effect, which is cool. I love seeing the return to hand effects after playing Dinosaur Kingdom for so long last year. So Magnetic Field's going to be a good spell. And then we also see him running Shrink as another spell, which is just, you know, you don't even think to see this in the deck. I listed it as one of the staples to look out for in a previous video, but it's just so goofy. You just target a face-up monster, its attack becomes halved. So that's that. Shrink is just good defense. You can also use it on yourself if you're looking for Magnetic Field to get the bounce back into hand. Because if you think about it, sometimes you don't want a monster going to the graveyard. You can, as you can tell, there's a lot of graveyard utilization here with these decks, and it seems like the hand is sometimes the least threatening place to be. So maybe you're shrinking yourself, you know, one of your Magnet Warriors or whatever's on the field, in order for Magnetic Field to bounce that monster to the opponent's hand. Moving on, just a couple traps here. We have Metaverse, which essentially is take a field spell from your deck and activate it or add it to your hand. So Metaverse just helps you get Magnetic Field out. This shows just how valuable Magnetic Field is, that it's worth having 2 Metaverse to try and search for it. You really, really want to see this early. Which, side note, you notice how we're not running any traditional magic removal here. There's some things that is going to be kind of integrated magic removal from the monsters, especially under XYZ and those fusions. But you notice how we're not running any Dust Tornadoes anymore, or Night Beams, or Wild Tornado? They're just not here. So, you know, the decks work very well without them. So, you know, without that magic removal, you really don't have to worry about losing your field spell. And then last trap here, we have 1 Magnetic Conversion, which I think we get up to 2 if we really wanted to. This one has you target up to 3 level 4 lower Magnet Warrior monsters in your graveyard, and you add them to your hand. So another reason why the graveyard isn't scary. You just get them back in your hand with something like Magnet Conversion. This can be kind of a late game trap, so I can see why maybe he just has it 1 here. Also, during either player's turn, except the turn it was in the graveyard, you can banish this card from the graveyard, target one of your banished Magnet Warrior monsters, special summon it. This one also works in a Haunted Shrine faction where it can act from the graveyard, and it says that banish doesn't matter. You can get stuff back from the banished, which is great if you're playing against a side like Kaiku. So there's a Magnet Conversion rounding out this early meta Valkyrian deck. Quick look at the side shows you we have 3 Kaiku, 3 Lost Wind. So Lost Wind, we saw him side pretty heavily in the final match against the XYZ Dragon Cannon because it works so well against Summon from the extra deck. And then Kaiku is good against a lot of other decks because there are a lot of decks that are running Foolish Burial and trying to utilize the graveyard. Kaiku would just banish two of those cards from the graveyard if you happen to do battle damage to your opponent. But against a deck like XYZ Dragon Cannon with Union Scramble, it's really not as effective as you'd think. So we actually saw him kind of stay away from this one in that particular match. But there's the second place Valkyrian deck for you. It's really great to see these 2 decks on top here this early in the meta. I hope that it stays this way because these decks make you think. The synergy is there in spades, but there's just so many different ways you can combine the synergy and what you could fuse for, what you could pull from the graveyard, what you could pull from the banished, that makes this really fun to play right now. All right, guys, and that wraps it up for 2 of the best early meta decks here, and I hope these decks are here to stay because they are really fun to play. Are they a little one-sided against the other decks? It's hard to tell. I really think that the meta is still formulating and shifting, but if you guys want to put a deck together right now, I definitely recommend following one of these templates. I certainly think it'll get more defined the more that people practice with these decks and play against all sorts of other concoctions and combinations that are coming out of the box. Shout out to Ryan Atlas and GN for the top 2 decks here of this Yu-Gi-Oh! Legacy tournament. Like I said, I had the pleasure of commentating the semifinals and the finals with Terramaster over on that YouTube channel. I've linked Yu-Gi-Oh! Legacy's YouTube channel and Discord in the description below. Feel free to check those out. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll catch you later.